but there's a very strong shift to have this internal desire to live a different way. And it's just kind of giving yourself permission, one, to set boundaries, to get clear on your own value systems, and then three, find spaces that really are going to support you in doing that.
Welcome to Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions, the podcast where real life meets big dreams. I'm Johanna, your host, and every episode will dive into inspiring stories from PAs, doctors, and professionals who are also dreamers and mission-driven changemakers. From the hospital halls to the hearts of our homes, and even into communities across the world, we'll laugh, learn, and uncover the challenges, triumphs, and everything in between as we see life through each other's perspectives. Looking for more joy and balance in your career? Don't miss our free guide, How to Be a Fulfilled Provider, your quick boost of encouragement with tips to help you thrive while juggling all your hats you wear. And if you've got little dreamers at home, check out Little Evie's Big Dreams on Amazon. These stories are meant to spark imagination, courage, and kindness, perfect for bedtime or anytime. Follow along as Evie, a little Sri Lankan girl, brings joy and creativity to her community while daring to dream big. This podcast is also brought to you with love by the Ephraim Foundation International, because empowering children and families in rural Sri Lanka isn't just charity, it's continuing a legacy of hope and creating futures full of possibility. So grab your cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and get ready for uplifting conversations that will leave you inspired and equipped to make a greater impact. Let's jump in. Hi guys, welcome back to Medicine Motherhood Missions podcast. I'm so honored because I get to sit down with Dr. Jessica McIntyre today, though many know her simply as JMac. Jessica is a pediatric hospitalist, an educator, and above all, a deeply compassionate community builder. She is the founder of the Women Physicians Collective, a sanctuary and a movement she created to help women doctors reconnect with their identity, joy, and purpose beyond the clinical grind. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, she co-founded one of the largest online communities for U.S. providers as well. It was a Facebook group for physicians and APPs that grew to over 150,000 members. Through that space, she offered not only just practical collaboration, but safe emotional support at a time when clinicians around the country were facing crisis, uncertainty, and isolation. But Jessica's story doesn't stop there. She has walked through burnout, infertility, and even narcolepsy, and has spent years unlearning what success in medicine should look like. She's built women's circles, led women's networks, and guided other physicians into redefining what fulfillment means, not just in medicine, but in life. In today's episode, we'll talk about how she's learned to sit with grief and sadness, resist toxic positivity, and rewrite her own measure of success. We'll dig in to how she holds space for herself and others, how therapy and values have shaped her path, and why she believes that the way forward for women in medicine isn't just resilience, it's reconnection. So without further ado, let's welcome JMac.
Hey, thank you so much. That was such a great introduction. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, Jessica, it's such a pleasure to have you. And, I've seen you on Instagram, and that's how we connected. And it's just an amazing kind of journey that you've been on, just from starting out in medicine to where you are now. So just, tell us a little bit about yourself, what led you towards medicine itself.
Sure. So I'm a pediatric hospitalist in New Hampshire. However, long ago, I was a pediatric patient, and I really felt that my physicians and medical teams weren't listening to me. They were really speaking over my head to my parents, using jargon. And it was just a really confusing time for a bright teenager. And then I met a surgeon, and I will never forget this because within 2 minutes of meeting, he said, "Hey, what do you like to do? And how is this impacting your life?" And we talked about cheerleading, which was really important for me at the age of 14. And then he got out a pen and piece of paper and drew my pathology, talked about the surgery. And I remember walking out of that visit and saying to my parents, "I'm going to be a pediatrician because that is how medicine should be." And so I set that goal at 14. And in retrospect, though, there were kind of signs along the way. My parents were just cleaning their house out after 40 years of keeping all of my things. And they found this adorable piece of paper. It was a homework assignment from first grade. And it said, "A Cinderella dream. What do you want to be? What is your dream?" And I wrote, "I'm 28 years old. I'm a doctor."
My goodness.
Yep, well beyond 28 now, but I definitely accomplished that, which was really fun to see.
Yeah. It's really interesting how, like, those kind of self proclaiming prophecies really do start young, right?
Mhm.
And, we all have those interests that shine forth from those young ages. But it's such a amazing thing to actually find that, like,
Yeah.
and see it like, my gosh, this really was real.
Mhm.
That's amazing. And I love how that you saw that difference with the surgeon compared to other providers. Like, do you find that kind of is still the case in pediatrics to this day?
I think in general, the stress that the medical field is putting on physicians and providers is so high that it is really hard to take the time to have those conversations sometimes. And that's why I really love my job as a hospitalist because I don't have the constraints of a clinic schedule, for example.
Mhm.
So I specifically make a point every day to have conversations about things outside of the hospital, to look at pictures of babies when they're doing well and talk about we just talked about what's going on kids Christmas lists and their letters to Santa,
Right.
and I'm working Christmas this year. It's a really special time in the hospital, and
Mhm.
I'm excited about that. But I think that that's a very intentional effort, and with the amount of burnout that we experience, it can be extremely easy to lose sight of those little things that fill your joy cup at work.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, it's hard to be intentional, but
Hmm.
that's what we have to try to be. And speaking of burnout, during the pandemic, as I discussed in the intro, you built one of the most active physician Facebook groups in the US.
Hmm.
And incidentally, I actually participated in that, or at least, became a member of it to see
Hmm.
what was going on because of this totally new pandemic and what were we doing in medicine. I was working with a hospitalist group at the time, but for adults, not pediatrics. And so it's such an amazing thing to know that you were actually one of the founders of it, because it was massive and everyone seemed
Yeah.
to be on it. Everyone was trying to find out what to do. How did it that begin, and what surprised you most about what physicians really needed at that moment?
That was truly such an incredible experience and definitely a highlight of my career thus far. It
Hmm.
really started out with a simple DM between me and two of my colleagues from medical school. And we were like, "Guys, are you seeing this? Like, what's going on? We should start a Facebook group and invite some of the people that are in our med school class." 3 days later, we had 40,000 members, and it grew to 150,000 members. And there's still about 140 in it
Yeah.
right now. What I felt was so empowering was, we needed something in that was fast
Hmm.
and that we could put real-time information out because we didn't
Yeah.
have data or, rigorous
Hmm.
scientific we didn't have the time to get those studies yet. And
Yeah.
so it was really incredible and like a second full-time job for a couple of years because we had a very specific format that you had to have in order to
Mhm.
post, and that is what gave us the basically, that's what gave us the structure to keep the group really functioning at a high level. And so we had two things that we wanted to focus on. One, verifying that every person in it was a physician or APP. And two, making sure that it was an extremely psychologically safe group with no disrespect so that we could really ask the questions that we wanted to know about. And that sense of connection that people were looking for, that was really profound to me and really showed me what you could do online with a community of that size.
Yeah, if as I think back to that time too, it was something where, people were, wondering what to do, what's the
Mhm.
best evidence-based practice that we can incorporate into our treatment options that, could, sustain and treat patients effectively.
Mhm.
And yet it was also this kind of camaraderie feeling that you are working alongside people from across the nation who are still in the same boat as you, whether from, Oklahoma to California to, New Hampshire. And so it was really amazing that you can feel that connection and community despite it being an online humongous group.
Yeah. What I thought was so cool when I look back was not only the speed with which we were able to get the data out there and collaborate, but the fact
Mhm.
that we were able to outsource PPE to people that needed it
Mm,
and find beds for patients that were, hanging and decompensating in emergency departments like across state lines. It was
right.
really incredible to have this like truly grassroots effort to get patients and
Mhm.
healthcare teams what they needed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's amazing. So, I mean, what a great, moment to be able to be a part of that change and something so vitally just poignant in history. And, I think that's just something I wanted to just take a moment to like, talk about because it was something that a lot of people in medicine struggled with, seeing also the criticality of the patients and
Mhm.
the severeness of what we were seeing at that time. It's easy to forget that now that it's been a
Yes.
couple of years, and only people I feel like who actually experienced that and saw that may really recollect just how significant it was. And so um, it's amazing what you have done to help benefit patients and providers at that time.
Thank you. It was a big surprise.
Yeah, yeah. So like what else, so after creating that successful nationwide physician group, what are some of the key things that you found that was important in building in that continued success?
Mhm.
Um, because it triggered something for you, I think, right?
Yes, that's very true. So for me, before the pandemic is when I got interested in women's work and creating safe spaces. However, I'd always done that in very small groups and in person. And so this was the first time that I could see what impact a virtual space could be. And for me, like my big three takeaways were one, making sure that people were seen and heard in that group. Two, keeping it psychologically safe, which I think is truly paramount. And, we look at Facebook now and it has like the anonymous feature. And I think it's great that you can post with anonymity. However, there's something deeper about being able to post as yourself and be seen and heard and valued and not worry about backlash, right? And knowing that you're going to be met with respect and care and empathy. And so for me, the psychological safety is so important. And then for that group in particular, and for Women Physicians Collective moving forward, just a shared purpose of being there and like a mission driven way forward for the group. And at that time, it was saving lives, figuring out how to practice medicine with no evidence, creating evidence, and helping out with resources. And it was really incredible.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I want to hone on to that psychological safe space
Hmm.
that you're mentioning again, because I feel like, social media is well known for not being a
Hmm.
psychological safe place. And so, how do you create that safe space in these large groups, in online communities? What are some concepts or aspects that you're using to create a safe space?
I think the number one most important thing is making sure that the people that are in the group have that shared purpose and are there for the same reason. Two, that it is very clear what the expectations of behavior are for the group. And so when you joined a big group like the COVID group, we had very clear expectations for how to post. If you didn't follow them, the posts weren't approved. For
Mhm.
something different like Women Physicians Collective, where I want to encourage people to post anything, whether I want to embrace vulnerability and rewrite the script for vulnerability as being really like a superpower instead of something to be feared. I think in that case, it's really important to have community guidelines. And one of the things that I love about safe spaces for women in particular is this idea that we're not there to necessarily fix everything. We are there to witness. And so we don't give advice unless advice is specifically asked for. And I think that that idea is really atypical for people in healthcare because our job is giving advice, you know?
Yeah.
That's people come to us all times of day, our families, our friends, we're at a barbecue, everyone wants advice. And being in this space where that's not the expectation that you can just share without getting advice is really personally healing.
Yeah.
And knowing that you can always follow up and ask advice from, pulling the collective wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because it's such a unique thing that you said is vulnerability as a superpower. Because I feel like sometimes we feel like we've got to be so strong. We've got to
Mhm.
show that we're stoic and, impenetrable, and showing vulnerability as a weakness. And so I love how you're trying to flip that script a little bit because I think we need that able to be able to heal, right? If
Mhm.
we aren't able to find a place where it's safe enough to open up and to be free and to be able to tell people what we're really feeling, right?
Absolutely. And we need that to embrace the fullness and authenticness of like being human, right?
Mhm.
It's not all being
Yeah.
strong, right?
Yeah.
Vulnerability is strong. Like even there, that's a
That's
societal construct, right?
yeah,
That is still
exactly.
ingrained and we're working through, right?
Yeah.
Being vulnerable is strong and rewriting that script to make it safe is really important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes, especially in medicine, we, find it hard to open up because especially if you're talking to fellow colleagues,
Mhm.
you want to display a certain level of professionalism and a perceived perception of how you are, right?
Yeah, that perceived perception, that is huge.
Yeah. And so it's hard to break that down. How has, speaking of, breaking that down, it goes into like your definition of success, I feel like, too.
Mhm.
And how has that definition of success evolved over your career in order for you to kind of think in this kind of way and want to bring that same change for other women in medicine?
I love this question, so thank you so much. And I would also love to hear, after I answer, kind of how success has evolved for you as well. This is just one of my favorite things to talk about. And so for me, I have this idea, and it's called the ego versus the soul cup. And it's all about the first couple decades of your life, you really have to live with embracing and filling your soul cup, or sorry, your ego cup, right?
Mhm.
You're, especially going into medicine, you're at the top of your class. You're always trying to add things to your CV. You're saying yes more than you're saying no. You are just giving, 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 and doing, doing, doing. And all of those things serve a purpose. We like achievements, they make us feel good to a degree. And at some point, I find it's often during either residency or early attendinghood for physicians, we kind of realize like, what else? Like, okay, now I'm a physician, I've achieved these things. Like, who am I, right? And who am I outside of this job? And that's where the soul cup kind of comes into play. And so we spend a lot of time filling the ego cup. Some of those things that we do also fill the soul cup, but there's a lot of things that we forget about doing and, you know, kind of get disconnected with that we used to love to do that would really fill our soul cup. And so for me, redefining success has looked like embracing my hobbies again, rediscovering what they are, joy, meaning, creativity, like those are the things that fill my soul cup, and just making sure that I'm now being mindful of the harmony between the two.
Yeah, I think how I think about it is kind of similar, because when we're young, we're goal oriented, where we,
Mhm.
especially if we're wanting to have a career in medicine, we want to achieve certain goals, and that becomes our purpose, achieving those goals. And I felt like that was how it was in our 20s,
Mhm.
aiming towards that next goal, the next goal. And that felt like our purpose was achieving that goal, achieving that career. But then you realize, what really is the purpose in life? Is it just a career status?
Hmm.
and title, but I don't think that really brings real fulfillment.
Yes.
In my own life, I felt like it was giving back or doing the nonprofit and other creative things that I
Hmm.
really felt allowed me to kind of express where I my heart was. And so even though working in medicine is fulfilling in a way, but it just you can't have your whole identity in there.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, though, how purpose identity comes up so often in all of these podcasts with women in medicine.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like the whole purpose of how and why the Women's Physician Collective exists, right?
Hmm.
And as a pediatrician and a creator, how do you personally measure fulfillment now? And how does that differ from what you were taught in training?
I love that. So I have this little approach that I use. I call it the ACE approach, and it stands for aligned, connected, and energized. And so anytime I am faced with making a decision, I ask myself three questions. Does this align with my core values? Does this make me feel more connected? And that could be to self, purpose, others, my body, even when we're thinking about like, should I sign up for this yoga class or something? And then E is energize. Is this going to energize me or is this going to drain me? And if I can have a positive response to two of those three things, then I take it more seriously and think about saying yes to that ask. But if it's no to two of those three things, then that just doesn't align with what I want to do right now. And that's really hard, honestly, because we are perfectionists, that's ingrained within us, and saying yes and people pleasing. Many of us struggle with that. And so I find that having a little bit of a mental triage system helps me out. And that's very different than what it used to be because society used to be say yes, help make the sacrifice, help your team, be a team player. But sometimes being the best team player is making sure that you're staying mentally and physically healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because like, even now you can get so caught up in, like, "I wanna do this, I wanna do that. I need to," because even, like, being on social media, doing your, content creating and everything, I'm sure you see that there's always something else to try to achieve and portray or go towards that next level, right? We're constantly on this next
I
level,
have no
right?
idea what I'm doing on social media.
Yeah.
It's
It's like
it's
so
learning a
crazy.
whole other situation.
I know. And so, but it just is always constantly there's something to pull you to do something more and more. And I feel
Mhm,
like we never fully sometimes as because we're if we're still on that hamster wheel of trying to like just quote unquote be successful
mhm,
without looking at what you just pointed out in like aligning and connection and what is
mhm.
energizing to us, we're just constantly being drained and even in
And we get used to that. We
yeah.
normalize it.
Yeah, because even in work, you do this, you do that, they ask you to do this, and you feel obligated because you're out of loyalty or out of just like, oh, I'm supposed to do this, or I need to help this, I have to help them. But it's really important for us to kind of really look at that, medical triage system that you've created, because sometimes we think more about how it's beneficial to others rather than ourselves,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's interesting though, but what have you seen in other women physicians around this topic? How do you feel like, for women in medicine, especially as physicians, since that's your target demographic, like how have you kind of gauged, is that what you've seen across the board, or have you seen a shift in how women in medicine are living and practicing?
I love the idea of a shift because I feel like across the board, we are still so heavily reliant on external validation and constructs as defining what success means for us. But there's a very strong shift to have this internal desire to live a different way.
Mhm.
And it's just kind of giving yourself permission, one, to set boundaries, to get clear on your own value systems, and then three, find spaces that really are going to support
Mhm.
you in doing that. And so I find that many of us are still living based off of someone else's cultural set of rules. And
Mhm.
the desire, though, is very strong to start living in our own way. And I hope, we're seeing more research and evidence on women in medicine and how we can support them at different times of careers. Women interns are 19% less likely to still be working full time just 6 years out of training than men. And that's a really profound number.
Mhm.
60% of women physicians are burnout, which is consistently 10 to 15% higher than men. And it's just because we're living in this um, like societal, this just toxic structure that wasn't built for us.
Mhm.
And so you can see that with the data, but how do we change the system to where women want to stay in medicine and want to practice for longer and can do it full time successfully with juggling their duties at home too? That's really a big question.
Yeah. I think that's a huge question right now because a lot of, people in medicine are trying to find alternative routes
Hmm.
of success because it's just become such a struggle in general with burnout and the toxic kind of culture of medicine in a way.
Hmm.
Just to go off of what we were talking about in vulnerability, medicine, everything has to be invincible. Like when we were talking about the COVID pandemic,
Hmm.
people were that was like also kind of a badge of honor having to
Yeah.
work through such difficult times. You're trained, physicians go through residencies and fellowships, and they're trained to just take whatever comes their way and just be able to, perform and excel and treat no matter what is going on circumstantially, right? And so that kind of mentality then goes forward, generation after generation and creates this inability to understand being sick, is okay sometimes, like
It's
just to
human. It's
take
normal.
yeah, like, just to bring it down to, like, that kind of, level, sometimes even just taking a sick day is, like, offensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I really think that that comes back to the fact that it's such an ego driven field. I mean, from the start, again, it's about like being the best, not showing any sign of weakness. And illness, unfortunately, is like seen as a weakness, which is actually wild given that we make our living on
Exactly.
treating patients who we do not view as weak at all. But when it's
Exactly.
in ourselves, like it's just this really terrible culture.
I know.
And, all of those little things really kind of like make us build an armor. And when you're vulnerable and have to call off, it kind of feels like very risky, taking the armor off.
Mhm.
And I think that it's really hard too because we are trained to not want to inconvenience others, right? We're trained to not inconvenience whoever's at home that has to come in and cover my sick call, or the
Mhm.
poor outpatient providers that see 40 people a day. If they
Yeah.
call off sick, that's so much work, not only for their office staff, but how about their patients that maybe took off of work and are missing out on pay that day to reschedule?
Yeah.
And so I think being able to rewrite that with better backup call systems and just the acknowledgement that it is okay is really important. I had a wild situation recently where I got pretty sick at work and I was so dehydrated that I had to go to the ER for fluids.
Mhm.
And I none of my colleagues could come in for me. And so I was in the emergency department, IV in, fluid bolus is going. I like couldn't even sit upright for a little bit until like halfway through my second bolus. And
Yeah.
then my second bolus came in and I said, "Hey, can you reel in the computer on wheels and bring me a phone? Because I still have to call these consults back. I still have to write my
Yeah.
notes. I have people to round on." And I was in
Mhm.
the ER for about 4 or 5 hours of getting
Yeah.
my fluids, and then you soldier onward. During infertility, I was rounding with heat packs taped into my scrubs. Like,
Mhm.
it's just a really wild scenario, and I
Yeah.
love the word wild, so I've reclaimed that as a positive way, but this would be
Yeah.
wild in the traditional way of, "That's unfortunate."
Right. Yeah. It is very interesting. And I think that is why women sometimes we're like, also, how do we manage? Because, when you throw families in there and everything, and it's just a lot
Hmm.
to soldier through. But that's the strength that we, you know, perceive and, move forward with, showing that we can. But
And we can, but the
we
difference
can.
is, should we? Right?
Exactly.
Like we can do so much, but at what cost? And I think that that's what women are really starting to ask. And something has got to change, or else we're going to be in a world of hurt in 10 to 20 years with an even wider gap in access to care.
Yeah. And I think men are asking that question too,
Hmm.
not just women, because everyone is feeling it. Because I recently interviewed a surgeon. He wrote a book about how it was to go through residency, and that was all. It was all about that, and
Hmm.
from a man's perspective, a male surgeon's perspective. So I think on across the board, men and women are feeling that. Is it
Woo.
worth it, right? Is it really
Yes.
worth it? And what are we really achieving if there's no
Hmm.
actual sustainable health system foundation that we can all rely on? Because it can't be
Hmm.
just reliant on a few people. It has to be shouldered by a huge platform and foundation that is, we're not really there yet as a whole. And so, going back to that emotional mental health, you talked about grief and sadness and a little bit. How do you make room for real emotions in medicine?
I think we all don't make room for them first until we hit a tipping point. I always call it the black box. My mom was a child psychologist, and so I grew up with this black box idea. And
Yeah.
it was where any uncomfortable emotion got
Mhm.
shoved into the black box, locked up, and then it wasn't explored for a very long time. And then about halfway through residency, it was like the box exploded.
Yeah.
I developed panic disorder and anxiety and had therapy was so helpful for that. But just being able to realize that it can be safe to feel all of your emotions and not have a black box. But because of the ego driven time that I was in, I didn't feel that it was safe to explore those things that I was putting in there. Primarily for me, I had the unfortunate residency experience where I signed 16 pediatric death certificates over 3 years. I would put it in the box and then I would move on until eventually that was way too stressful. And I've had a panic attack at work and it was really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I
But
know.
don't worry, I gaslighted myself and I convinced myself it was just a viral gastro instead of a panic attack.
My
And then later
gosh.
on, I was like, that was actually panic.
Yeah, I know. That's what the interesting thing about medicine is that, you like you said, you signed 16 pediatric death certificates, which, any death is just hard to see, let alone a child. And making space for that grief and taking a moment to acknowledge that even while you're in that moment with the patient, I think is so important. I remember talking with another physician on the podcast who was talking about that too. Like, we have in that moment that needs to be acknowledged for the physicians and providers
Mhm.
to grieve. And otherwise, if we keep moving forward and dissociating, that's going to cause, like what you said, you
Yeah.
kind of saw the repercussions of that later on.
Yeah. And that's so hard too, because it really depends on the environment. Like, I was very blessed that I worked at a children's hospital that had this incredible palliative care team, and they
Mhm,
really got the residents involved in showing us how to create this quote unquote like beautiful like death transitions.
mhm,
And so I was involved in some of those, and they really were experiences that are very special and were meaningful to us and to the family. And being able to sit in that with grief with the family and also
mhm,
celebrate a child's life, that feels extremely different than traumas coming into the emergency department
mhm.
where you code somebody, they
Mhm.
pass, and then you have a waiting room of sometimes 100 people waiting. That is just so hard.
Mhm.
And I think that that's why the black box exists, because you
Mhm.
have to shut it down and move on sometimes.
That is true. How do you like differentiate between like being supportive and empathetic versus that toxic positivity in those moments or in any moment?
Yeah. To me, empathy is just truly being able to name reality, and toxic positivity kind of ignores reality or tries to rewrite it and can kind of lead into gaslighting. And so we recently had a very long code, and I was with the resident afterwards, and I said, you know, that was really hard. Let's take a few minutes to acknowledge that. Like, I see that you're struggling. Let's talk about it, where when I was a resident, I had some experiences where people were like, all right, we're good here. Did we debrief? Like, yep, we're okay. Let's go see on to the next. And when I think about that, that's probably their coping mechanism, right? So it's not necessarily that those attendings were at fault. That is what the system trained us to do. And so to now be able to start rewriting that for the next generation, I think is really important to come from a place of this job is really hard sometimes. What are you going to do after work today to decompress? Let's talk about that. When's your next shift? How are you sleeping? Like things like that are just really important to be able to explore versus ignoring it and expecting everyone to be okay.
And what does it look for you to sit in that grief personally or professionally?
You know, my answer in residency would have looked very different than my answer today. And honestly, my ability to sit with grief depends on how safe I feel, and safety is one of my core values. And so, for example, when we were going through infertility, there was a time where, in order to function, I just like shut down feelings. I was emotionally numb and I could not feel grief or happiness. And so for me to invite grief in when I realized that there was a problem, I had to invite in uh, gratitude at the same time to kind of balance. And I actually gave myself a 10-minute window a day to feel the grief. And so I would set an alarm and I would allow myself to just gripe and cry and say whatever crummy things I had to say.
Right.
And then the alarm would go off and I would say, okay, I can do that again tomorrow. And then over time, I realized that my 10 minutes, I was like ready to move on at like 4 minutes. And then slowly I allowed myself to just sit with the grief and recognize that it was part of my life now and that that was okay. But I could also start feeling the gratitude. And so now, we tried to have children for years. We were unsuccessful. And that also led to redefining what success looked like, right? And so now I just sit with both grief and gratitude. And I probably will for my life. And that's okay because that's the human experience. And we just have to allow ourselves to sit with both in a safe and healthy way.
Yeah. Yes. It's hard to even sit with grief, right? Because we're such a culture, I feel like, where anything negative, we don't want to deal with it.
Hmm.
We just want to like move on, right? And I
Yeah.
feel like I think I was listening to something about that recently too. Just we're not dealing with grief well enough. And that's why so many of us just have a hard time learning how to mourn when
Hmm.
things are, hard, and learning how to kind of even be okay with loss
Hmm.
because we're so used to everything has to be good and positive and, you know,
Toxic positivity.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And so it's really hard for us to just sit there with grief and
Hmm.
understand what we have lost because we want to just move on to what can we get next
Yeah.
to make up for what we've lost.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. That really is very interesting to think about, like, what can we get next to help with that? I think as a society, I wish that we could do better talking about death in loss. I actually love talking about it because I feared it for so long. And not saying that I don't fear it now, but I just think that having those deep conversations are really meaningful. And mourning the life that you thought you would have, especially us as women in medicine, we all have an idea of this life, right? And then we're living it and we're like, wait a second, like I have a lot of mom friends that are never home to tuck their kids in or have missed their last 3 plays at school. Like you can grieve that. That's normal, right? That we should grieve that. That's not something to be toxically positive about. Like, yay, mom was like saving a life. Like that's gratitude for your skill set and grief that you had to sacrifice something. And that is why I hate the idea of work life balance, because that's just setting us up to fail, to think that we can be balanced. I really like to think about it as like more like work life harmony or integration. Like, how can we be okay with how these things are working together?
Exactly. Because everyone has dreams,
Hmm.
everyone has goals, no matter wh- who you are. You'll have a goal, you'll have a dream. And, if you really want it, you will make a way to get it. And that comes at the loss of something else
Hmm.
to gain what you want. Something's going to be given up on at any certain point of time. And I feel like that also goes into regret as well.
Hmm.
And, even regret can, be a form of loss and things that we have to kind of be okay with. And it's hard though. And so, yeah, it's definitely not a balance, and it's no matter what career you're in or what choices you make in life, you can't always have a balance. You'll always have a loss of something or a regret of something.
Hmm.
And that's kind of learning about how to sit with grief, because there will always be something that is not going to be perfect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because I think when I think about regret, like I definitely have like loss, but I don't think I have many regrets. And I think it's because I think about value systems a lot, right? And so when I'm making a choice and I'm thinking and I'm truly living in alignment with the value system, you can feel the loss and sit with that, but you know that it came from and you're like from within. And so I don't feel the regret piece a lot personally, and so I think that for people that are feeling a lot of regret, getting crystal clear on their value system, like I know that's kind of mainstream to say, but honestly, it's really important. And knowing your values is just huge for fulfillment.
Yeah, which is why, I brought up that regret, because sometimes, people may feel like we have to do this or we have to do that, but you gotta look at what do you really want in life and what would you be happy about not missing out on, or what would you be happy about pursuing no matter what?
Hmm.
Like, those goals, like when you were a 20-year-old, pursuing that medical degree and, going for it with all your heart and soul, those types of goals that you want to achieve no matter what. And you'll
And
be
it's okay if
okay.
those
Yeah,
change too,
exactly.
right? Yeah, like that's the beauty. The things I wanted when I was 20 are not the things I want at 38, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so being okay and giving yourself permission to adjust your goals so that you can live and redefine success is so healthy.
Yeah. Because every season is different.
Mhm.
And I think I was talking about this the other day too, like, because you can have two people in the same job and they'll be in totally two different seasons of their
Mhm.
life, and they'll need completely different goals, completely different values, completely different dreams, completely different situations, even if they are in the same job doing the same thing, at the same level, but they have different seasons in their life. And I think
Yeah.
that's what we have to understand with that aspect of, what we want, and that gratitude and being able to understand
Mhm.
where we are in life.
And your personal seasons will change.
Mhm.
I was in the same job as an attending 3 years ago at the infertility, the bottom of the pit,
Yeah.
and at that time, I just needed to, like, get myself to work and get through the day, you know?
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
it looks totally different now where every single
Mhm.
patient I'm finding joy and, seeing how
Yeah.
can I incorporate this into med ed today? And so allowing yourself and
Yeah.
giving yourself grace for your ups and downs is also very important.
Yeah. Speaking of that, how did you I know you mentioned the 10-minute, allowing yourself that
Hmm.
actual verbal grief.
Hmm.
What other habits or rituals did you kind of like incorporate to kind of go about daily gratitude and rethinking or being able to understand what you're coping with or challenged with each day?
So I think, first of all, it's really important to be very honest with yourself. And the idea of writing down the things I was grateful for at the time,
Mhm.
that felt too hard. And that's the reality is that sometimes those little things can just feel too hard. And so I thought, well, if that's too hard and I can't think of anything I'm grateful for big scale, then how about I go really tiny little scale and think about little sensory things? And so I
Mhm.
started with 3 things a day. The sun is warm on my skin, and that feels nice, you know?
Mhm.
Or, oh my gosh, we just put a new bird feeder up and I've seen 3 different species today. Like, that's really fun. Or as simple as, hey, the roads on the drive to work didn't have any ice today and I could go the normal speed limit. Like, that sounds silly, but when you start to reframe and you find all these normal things that we take for
Mhm.
granted and you start putting them through a lens of gratitude,
Mhm.
the change can absolutely be profound.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do we like differentiate that from toxic positivity?
Hmm.
Sometimes we may feel like, are we being just too positive? But when we're actually just looking at things that are going well in our lives, right?
I think of it, the difference is intention. Right?
Mhm.
So when I am looking at these things that I'm very happy and grateful for, I'm intentionally saying, hey, these are nice things in my life. I'm not ignoring or discounting the
Mhm.
negative things, right? I could list you 10 of each right now, right? And so it's more just trying to get a filter of, all right, what are the good things in my scenario right now? Like, for example, when I'm at work and I get paged at 3 a.m. and I have narcolepsy, so sometimes it's really hard for me to like get up. The reality is like that stinks. And so you're walking down to the ER and you're like, what am I walking into? And so I'm not going to toxic positivity my way out of that, but I'm going to try to put myself back in my body. And so I'm going to be like, all right, I can like feel my feet hitting the ground and like I feel grounded. I feel calm right now. That's wonderful. I'm waking up. I feel hydrated. There's the nurse that always has my back. Hey, how you doing? And so just noticing and learning to live in the present. Honestly, that was probably the greatest gift that came out of our infertility journey because during that time, I was living so far in the future with things that I didn't have that I could see other people having that I completely lost touch of how to live in the present.
Mm.
And gratitude and just noticing is what brought me back to that.
Yeah. That's really important and profound that when you're thinking about those types of things that you want but can't have, and you think
Hmm.
about what isn't rather than what is right now.
Hmm.
That's really profound
And
to
it takes
really go back
practice.
to.
It's not like just like we had to study a lot for medicine. Sometimes you have to study a lot or practice to enjoy life again. And that's okay. But it has to be an intentional,
Mhm.
hey, this sucks and I know it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to do this for 15 seconds a day. And then it will
Mhm.
become so much easier.
My husband having to go through cancer, I mean, he did have
Hmm.
a loss of different things in his health that, at the time we had to really focus on what is good, right? And
Hmm.
even still, because when you go through those types of physical illnesses, sometimes they do have some lasting effects, some they don't have any lasting effects, but that memory and that feeling of is still always there, right? And you have to be able to kind of be like, we had to face that loss,
Hmm.
but now we still have life, right? We
Yes.
still have life, we still have this, we still have something to look forward to. But and so that's kind of what you're, talking about, right? Even through that loss, even through that grief that we had, what do we have right now? And we still have a life that we can look for the good things in it and forward for, right?
And it's okay
Hmm.
to grieve the person you were, right? And you can grieve the person you were, the life that you thought you were going to have, and
Hmm.
simultaneously find joy and gratitude in the life that you do have, right? It's just when we get stuck in that wheel of not being able to do that is
Hmm.
really when things can get dark. All right. Have you ever done one of the value exercises where you get like a list of like 100 values and whittle it down to your top five? All right. We should link that in our,
Yes,
because I
yes.
have actually, I have like an ACE approach little guideline that walks you through it. And the
Okay,
first
yeah,
page
great.
is getting aligned
Hmm.
with your values. I
Uh-huh.
find this extremely fun. And I think it's really fun to do with your family too. Like hearing my 85-year-old Mima's values at that stage in her life are just really interesting and lead to some beautiful conversations. So I like to start with a list of like usually like 50 to 100 values, and you really compare each one and you're like, which one is most important to me? For example, community and connection, people might think that those are the same, but when you really break them down, no, like connection is actually more valuable to me, right? And so I do this exercise about twice a year. My husband and family, we all do it on in January every year to talk about it.
Yeah.
And this year, at this moment in my life, my top five values are authenticity, connection, safety, integrity, and growth. And these help me keep my like ego and soul cup in harmony and also guide how I show up and how I'm able to show up for
Mm-hmm.
my family and friends in medicine and in building Women Physicians Collective.
Yeah. That's pretty awesome. Yeah, link it, and
Mhm.
we've got to. I've got to do it.
It's so fun.
It's
And I would
yeah,
love to know what your values are.
yeah, for sure. I'll definitely post it, make a Instagram thing about it, maybe.
Mhm.
So, going towards the Women's Physicians Collective, and then you also before had told me about this Wild Women project, because I
Yeah,
think that played a part in all of this. How
huge
exactly did
part.
it all work out?
All right. So first of all, second year of residency, I kind of alluded to like having a rough time at some point. And it was after a really hard weekend. I was on a
Mhm.
28-hour PICU shift. I had just intubated a baby and I got stomach cramps. And I was like, no. And so I hit it to the call room and I went in there and I tried to convince myself I was having gastro, but no, indeed. I could feel my throat closing and hyperventilation. So I knew that this was a panic attack.
Mhm.
And so I was having my first panic attack, and at the root of it was all I've wanted to be since I was 14, maybe even younger, was a doctor. And now I am. But who am I outside of that? I have no idea what my identity is other than Dr. McIntyre. So I did the most millennial thing ever and whipped out my phone and I Googled how to find yourself dash. And the first page, I'm like scrolling through. I'm like, ah, nothing there really, strikes my soul. And then I
Mhm.
found something called the Wild Woman Project, and it was just strange enough to where I was like, I'm intrigued. So I
Yeah.
clicked it, and it was all about finding your true, authentic self and
Mhm.
living in a way that is raw and untamed and embracing your wild nature. And I was feeling so raw in that moment that that language really resonated with me. And I really liked the idea that it was this like women's only space. And so I signed up to go to Wild Woman Fest, which is at that time was camping on the top of a mountain with 150 women. And I had no idea what I was getting into. I was not ready for the experience, I will tell you that. However, it like cracked me open. Like you're standing there talking
Mhm.
about ancestral trauma, which I didn't know what that was at the time. And everyone's like, release it, just like let it out. And I'm like, wow, these women are so good at this. Like I can't stand here and yell. So I'm standing there watching all these women like doing really great and, perfectionist. So like I want to do good too, right? But what are people going to think? And so I was like, I literally went, "Beep, beep," and I'm like, "Okay, that's, like, not a yell. I'm not releasing anything." But I
Right.
kid you not, a thunderstorm happened and it like boomed and this thunder happened and started raining. I'm like, well, now no one can hear me, so I'm going to do it, you know? And so I let out this like guttural animalistic yell, and it was like this little door cracked open in my soul and was like, there you are. Hello. Like, thank you for listening to us again. And so now, fast forward like 8 years later, or actually 10 years later, I've been leading Wild Women Circles for over 6 years now,
Oh, wow.
online and in person. It's just a really incredible way for women to
Mhm.
get together in a very like safe space where I lead
Yeah.
them through guided visualizations and we talk
Mhm.
about intention setting and shares, which are always optional. And so that was really the seed for Women Physicians Collective, was that night in the PICU, realizing I was completely disconnected from my identity and purpose. And then finding myself through a community of women again and wanting to create that space for women in medicine. And so what's really unique about Women Physicians Collective is not only can you get CME and it's on a private
Yeah.
platform, but we have women's circles once once a month, every other month. And so I haven't seen anything that combines those things together in that type of way.
Yeah, that's really unique, to have something so authentic
Hmm.
given one of your values for the
Yeah.
year because I feel like, we discussed a little bit about this before of how like composure, being polished and,
Hmm.
stoic is kind of par for the course for people in medicine.
Hmm.
But to have that raw kind of visceral response and, letting it all go is very unique. And not
Hmm.
a lot of us ever do that much.
Hmm.
And so like how do you like so what did that really like kind of capture about you that, allowing yourself to kind of be so raw and open with others? Or was it just you were able to kind of actually be more free and let yourself see
Both.
what's
100%. When I was growing up, I was really connected with myself and my inner child and intuition. And
Mhm,
the medical training and culture just really led me far away from that. And
mhm,
so it was really beautiful to reconnect with my inner voice that I hadn't listened to for a very long time. And so it was very freeing to be able to do that. And then also realize through demonstration from these other women how awesome vulnerability is,
mhm,
and how helpful it is. And basically, that moment changed my approach. And now I am like where I'm so honest and open about everything because I'm just very authentically vulnerable.
uh-huh,
But I love that. And I'm also very okay for women that do not feel safe doing
mhm,
that. And so I want to create the space to where they can come and explore it in a way that may be completely silent and just internal,
mhm,
or explore it with fellow physicians who are also exploring it and kind of seeing how it feels. And
mhm.
so it's just, participation in those types of things is just always optional because everyone is at a different stage and has a different relationship with being vulnerable.
And yeah, so your women's physician collective allows people to be a part of other groups. And so like tell us a little bit about like the women's physician collective, just a little bit more of like what someone could expect.
Sure. So, Women Physicians Collective is an annual membership. And right now we're offering a Founders Circle deal. So, I'm very excited about that. And what it includes is the Empowered Woman CME series, which is really exciting because it is all focused on women's health that we can use that's applicable to our lives. And we're talking moral distress, pelvic floor dysfunction, sleep hygiene for the shift worker, all of that kind of stuff that's like really relevant to us and can help us be better doctors to our patients. And so, but we want to do it in a way that really fits into a busy schedule. So there's only one CME a month. It's live and on demand. And then there's one circle, women's circle, and that alternates with a guest pop-up. So for example, January, we're having a women's circle, but in February, we're doing a pelvic floor physical therapy session. And so we're just kind of going back and forth between like some
Yeah.
fun, unique experiences.
Uh,
And that's what I really want, is this to be a place to show up for experience and
yeah.
authenticity. And then we're working it disconnection drivers and like figuring out what your disconnection driver is right now and how to balance that with kind of the framework that we work through, which is called the vitality loop.
Wow, that's so amazing. You've got a lot of options. And I think, given, how we are right now, the focus on women's health is something that's like really coming up in focus more because we've found it very lacking.
Yeah.
And it's really amazing how, there isn't a lot of information out there for like people to really understand perimenopause, menopause, and all those different things. And but
Hmm.
now people are speaking up because all of us are turning, into that age range of
Yes.
perimenopause, and we all kind of are much more vocal than our parents' ages
Yep.
and generations. And we are actually wanting answers, and we don't want to be like it's just the norm. It's not normal,
Hmm.
and we shouldn't live with unhealthy
Yep.
patterns
Oh,
and
I can feel
lifestyles.
better. Okay, let's do
Yeah,
it.
exactly. So it's pretty neat how you're kind of incorporating all of that into like actual CME for providers.
Hmm. Yes.
Still,
So, first of all, thank you again so much for inviting me. This has been such a lovely hour, and I love talking about all these things. So, I really appreciate the invitation to do so. And I'm wondering if you'd be open to closing out our chat the way that I close out my Wild Women circles.
oh, okay. How do you close out your wild women circles?
All right. So, we take 3 breaths, and the
Okay.
first breath is just where we're going to kind of like ground into ourselves because we've been doing a lot of like chatting and just kind
Yeah.
of like a way to come home. And then the second breath in our circles is me blowing out the candle. So here it will just be like grounding times two.
Okay.
And then the third breath is the best one. We howl because accessing that like inner
Yeah.
wild and raw authentic person is like so atypical and abnormal and we're not used to it, but it's like fun. It brings in like our inner child, our inner wild woman, and I just have such a great time with it. And so we can do like little tiny baby howls or you can
Yeah.
go for it, whatever you're feeling.
Right.
But are you down?
Yeah, let's do it.
All
It's
right, let's
totally
do it.
atypical for me. So
Yep, yep. All right, breath one, breath two, and breath three. Oh, highly encourage you to go find a kidlet and have them show you how to howl because dang, they are good at it.
Oh, I'm sure I can find one pretty soon. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I loved our conversation. And I hope that anyone out there will be able to check out Women's Physicians Collective, learn more about it, and hopefully, you've gained a lot of information from this podcast that'll help you along your journey too. Thank you so much, JMac, for your vulnerability, your wisdom, and your fierce commitment for creating real community in medicine. Hearing your journey, though, through burnout, infertility, and self-discovery reminds us that being a healer doesn't mean we stop needing healing
Hmm.
ourselves. For everyone listening, if anything JMac shared hit home today, whether it was about redefining success, making space for grief, or simply building connection with other women in medicine, I encourage you to check out the Women's Physicians Collective. It's more than a network, it's a lifeline. You can find them on Instagram at Women Physicians Collective. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend, especially another provider who could use this kind of encouragement. And if you want to dive deeper, send us a message or drop us a note on social. We'd love to hear your takeaways, experiences, or any questions for JMac. Thank you again to everyone listening. May you continue to reclaim your joy, trust your voice, and live medicine and life on your own terms. Until next time, keep
Back
sparking
together
hope.
how?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. We hope you found inspiration, insight, and a sense of connection in the stories we shared today. If you enjoyed today's episode, Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram for updates, free downloads, and join a community of like-minded individuals passionate about making a difference through medicine, motherhood, and mission work. Remember, you're not alone in this journey. Until next time, keep sparking hope, keep healing, keep nurturing, and keep making a difference. This is Johanna signing off from Medicine, Motherhood, and Missions. The medical opinions expressed on this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be considered as medical advice. Always consult a licensed healthcare provider for personal medical concerns or questions. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the podcast host.